Yeah, the question was, can you, I guess, provide more specifics on the cost for developing a project? I could refer back to a slide that breaks that down, but you typically are looking at actual development costs. Yeah. Now the other one. There you go. Yep. So I will say it ranges based off of project type, standard, but in general, you have a cost of doing a feasibility assessment, and if you're developing an actual protocol or methodology, that usually takes on significant costs. But considering that outside of direct development costs, you're looking at between $250,000 to $500,000. And those costs are typically your first year costs, and then they don't carry forward. So you have ongoing verification, maintenance, management costs, but the upfront costs are really related to developing. So a developer comes in to do the work. You then have your third-party verification, your legal costs, and then there's just program-related fees that range.
Great. Jordan, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, a quick follow-up. So there's these existing protocols like forestry in California and stuff. So how much can those be used as templates so you're not investing, say, $100,000 on that second line item every time you want to develop a similar project? And I think Leia's going to speak to this later, but the state's developing a forestry protocol. So how much could someone else use an existing protocol to reduce that cost, or you got to reinvent the wheel every
that's
based on your species or whatever it is?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I guess to repeat it. Can you look at applying an existing protocol or using existing protocols to a new program? And the answer is yes, you can. If Hawaii is developing their own protocol, they're likely referring to the protocol developers, which are oftentimes also the registries. So that development cost of estimated around $100,000 does not have to come every time you're developing a project at all. Protocols by design they look at how they can be applied in multiple locations, locations more or less.
Michael, did you?
And basically, just a little bit reiterate what Steve said, and it's the standards. The standards or programs, particularly in the voluntary sector, that would be the Climate Action Reserve, VERA. The gold standard in the compliance space, there would be the compliance, the regulators, so California Air Resources Board. They would develop these protocols, and then yes, they're developed primarily with the purpose of being able to be reusable so that they can be used on multiple projects. Due to the cost of investment to create a protocol, there is interest when a protocol is developed to be able to reuse it. And so if you do have a greenhouse gas reduction project or action that you're taking, using an existing protocol is by far the more streamlined way to go.
Great. Does anybody else have? Yes. Yes.
I was wondering, have any of the existing protocols or methodologies found a way to use proxies for the actual measurements on each site that I would imagine would be kind of prohibitively expensive for smaller project developers, whether it's within the formal carbon tradable markets or in other kinds of transactions? Has anyone found a way to find legitimate proxies that alleviate some of that cost?
So the question was, are there within protocols or some methodology proxies that allow for smaller quantity projects to be able to generate. And generally, there haven't been, and quantity is an important aspect to consider financially. There certainly are efforts to do that, and even within the protocols, there are proxies used, such as emissions factors, that take complicated things and bring them down to where you can use them. So earlier in the day, I talked about the different sources and emissions when you are calculating an inventory. The same kind of methodologies go towards calculating reductions. And so there are, within the protocols as they exist already, proxies to help that. But to streamline it down so that you can start to create offsets at lower quantity levels is a very challenging thing. And one detail that I'm aware of that, and I spoke to this a little bit in the Q&A earlier, is the urban forestry. There's been a lot of efforts within the standards and programs to really elevate that protocol and define those proxies, because it's something that people are interested in and they want to put forward. But to date, they haven't been able to come up with something that they can sit behind and say, yeah, this is real and quantifiable, and we can maintain the quality with these proxies. So there's certainly efforts, there's certainly interest, but as far as I know, and Steve, you may have a different piece of knowledge here, but as far as I know, there are those efforts, but they haven't really.
Yeah, I think that's consistent.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question.
I'm just curious, for the inventories, it's kind of an annual basis, so many tons per year. With this, it's a project. So I'm assuming it's a life cycle type analysis that goes into it, or do you discuss that?
So in terms of the ongoing development costs, is that what?
Oh, I'm sorry, no, more in general, in terms of calculating how many, I'm sorry, I shifted to just in general, when you're talking about how many tons a given project offsets. You discuss life cycle evaluations, or maybe it's something like that.
Yeah, so I think that the question is, within any of the protocols, do they use life cycle considerations, or is it always annualized? Is this the question?
That's a better question.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so typically they do bring them down to a ton, and then when that ton occurs is something called the crediting period. And so that is, the tons are based on a specific crediting period. So when you're dealing with a ton of reductions, there's not a lot of, well, there is some concern, but there really shouldn't be, of temporally when that happens in time. So a reduction is a reduction. There is a crediting period and a vintage associated with an offset, but the time frame by which it happens isn't that much of a concern, because those, for example, carbon budgets I mentioned before are just the total that we have. It doesn't really matter whether we exceed that in the next year or in the next 20 years. So that's that piece, and I don't believe that there's a protocol that does take into consideration life cycle. I can't think of one off the top of my head where they're taking pieces out. Primarily, I would imagine it has to do with being able to quantify and guarantee. So I'm not sure that. So a long way to say I don't think so. And
Yeah, I think that's about right. Yeah, I would just add, it's very also project specific too, in terms of what the project activity is and how that's accounted for. And then you also have ongoing verifications that are basically doing another review of those ongoing reductions. And those get looked at from an annual basis and projected forward too, if you're looking at it from a purchase agreement.
Okay, one more question here.
Yeah, So you talked a lot about the co-benefits of carbon offsets. Would you also agree that it could be like increased harmful effects, like increased local like co-pollutants? For example, if you're like offsetting a power plant emission, you can offset the carbon from like a forestry project. You're gonna still have the local co-pollutants like toxic ash and mercury, like from the offset, like even if you regardless of the offset. So I'm just wondering, if there's a limit to offsets when we're talking about the environment.
Yeah, so the question is, with co-benefits, are there negative consequences to offsets? And the answer is potentially, and this is what the idea of additionality is intended to address, making sure that you're not transferring the pollutant from one area to the other. The other thing to address, and there'll be some environmental justice presentation later. And so, even within the offset itself, I think every major protocol has a requirement that every other environmental regulation must be met at the facility or site producing the offsets. There was an issue in California system where there was another environmental regulation that was a problem. The greenhouse gas reductions from the offset project were actually happening, but there was some level of invalidation that was performed because of other environmental negative consequences. So it's a concern. It's something that is constantly being diligently addressed as offsets continue to be looked at and used. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, it's a very valid point. It's more or less being referred to as demonstrating direct environmental benefits. And I mentioned the change in the offset allocations for California that have been reduced from 8%. And a lot of that is based off of a lot of issues that have been raised in California that they are not seeing any direct environmental benefits from these offset projects because they have refineries in their backyard. The reality is that, there's no zip code really to climate change, but there's certain locations where people are affected more severely due to sources of emissions. So we're looking, in Oregon, we're looking at that very closely as well. And in the proposed legislation, it looks at 4% for Oregon that would have to demonstrate environmental benefits to impacted communities. So it's something that people are definitely calling more attention to. And it's a tough one because, as I mentioned, a reduction is a reduction, but when you still have smokestacks in your backyard, doesn't make you feel good.
I guess I just add to that a little bit, just to emphasize what I was emphasizing this morning is that offsets are a tool to help implement greenhouse gas reductions. And so the tool needs to be implemented appropriately. So like any tool, you could misuse it and there could be problems. And so in understanding offsets, if any market or if it's created, if any GHG reduction is converted to that credit, you have to understand what that process is and the value and concerns around creating that, using that tool for these creations. So it's something that's a really important issue to address, and I'm glad you asked the question.